Hi, this is Brian Simmons. Welcome to Module 13 of Interpersonal Communication, Profanity. For the next several modules, we'll be taking on different topics in interpersonal communication that are standalone. They don't quite fit under a broader topic like communication in friendships or communication in romantic relationships. Yet each of these topics is itself unique, and I think you'll find that each of these topics is also quite common in everyday interpersonal communication. And so today in Module 13, we start with profanity. Before we begin, let me say this. This module is intended to share with you the academic research on profanity. It's not intended to talk about it from a biblical standpoint, nor is it intended to talk about it from any kind of a moral standpoint. For our purposes, I'm not concerned what your own personal views are regarding profanity. I'm not concerned with how often you use profanity or the words you use. Instead, what I'm concerned with is talking about some of the ways that researchers in communication have examined profanity. The research on profanity is actually quite large, but most of it tends to replicate previous research. And so there are just a handful of research findings pertaining to profanity that we need to talk about. Let's begin with this. Profanity is deeply rooted in culture and in social contexts. In fact, one of the things we know about profanity is that it's a cultural universal. Every culture on the planet has its own version of profanity. Now, the words or the gestures might differ from one place to another, but the fact of the matter is profanity is something that all cultures have in common. And so what sociologists and other communication scholars have tried to do is look at profanity with the widest possible lens. And when we do that, one of the things we find is that actually profanity is quite useful. And so most researchers have tended to adopt a functional viewpoint toward profanity. What we mean by that is simply this. Profanity is useful. It serves a particular function. It has a purpose in the cultures in which it occurs. And so therefore, if you understand the culture and the purposes that profanity serves, you'll be able to better understand how it is and why it is people make use of profanity. Ironically, most profane references have something to do with sexuality or some other kind of a taboo topic. So for example, in the United States, F-U-C-K is a kind of profanity, and it refers to a sexual activity. It becomes a kind of taboo topic in the sense that we don't want young people, or at least people that are too young, using that word or talking about those kinds of things. So you have this word, the F word, that is making reference to something that people understand as being, well, distasteful. Not necessarily the act or what goes into it, but the way we're referring to it. So rather than using synonyms such as medical terminology of sexual intercourse, instead we use the more raw, profane kind of a term, F-U-C-K. In fact, the term profanity is rooted in the word profane, and the word profane is used as an opposite. So if the word profane over here is juxtaposed against the word holy over here, you find an understanding of the word profane. Profane means everyday. It means mundane. It means the stuff of this world. Its opposite, holy, refers to something that is other, something that is an otherworldly kind of a thing. So profanity fundamentally is taking, if you will, the common, the ordinary, the dirty, if you will, as opposed to the extraordinary, the clean, the uncommon. And so the various words that count as profanity and some of their euphemisms that go along with them are all in one fashion or another rooted in sexual or anatomical kinds of terms. And so profanity, through a functional lens, can be seen as a way to talk about those kinds of things without doing so in such a way that brings stigma. Now, that's ironic because the use of those words themselves brings a kind of a stigma. So, for example, a 6-year-old or 7-year-old boy might not be comfortable using the phrase sexual intercourse, but he's heard his older brother use the F-U-C-K word, and so he picks that word up as a kind of colloquial thing. On top of that, we find that most people would argue that these words have a kind of social power to them. When you use them, you're able to elicit a kind of response that oftentimes you wouldn't elicit. My favorite example of this is in the movie A Christmas Story. There's a scene in that movie where a family, mother and father and 2 kids, are driving along in their car. The car has a blowout, and so the tire must be changed. So the father and the son both hop out of the car to change the tire. The father's doing the hard work, the son is doing the help. Now, the kid is about 9 years old in this movie. And so as the father is removing the lug nuts, he puts them into the hands of the small child. Unfortunately, the child drops the lug nuts and they can't find them in the accumulated snow. As soon as that happens, the 9-year-old boy utters the F word. He says O-F-U-C-K. However, that causes the father to stop and send the child back into the car. The kid's in trouble. When the father gets back to the car, he says to his wife, "Do you know what your son just said?" "He just said," and then he whispers that word into his wife's ear. Now, what's interesting for our purposes is the wife's response. The wife immediately screams and says, "Ah, not that!" See, that word has power. It has emotive force, which is the term that communication scholars use. And so profane terms, even when they're dropped into an environment where they're quite common, for example, the locker room of a football team or a U.S. Marine base, those words still have emotive force. We also know that from a functional standpoint, profanity can be seen as a way of acting out or pushing back against the system. Sometimes people will use profane words simply because they're trying to elicit that reaction, and in doing so, they're pushing back against relative powerlessness. So oftentimes, young kids will start to use profane terms because they figured out that not only does it elicit a reaction from parents because of the emotive force we talked about a moment ago, we find that that also serves their purposes of being able to push back and exert some power in their relationship with their parents, which they perceive they might not have. So whether it be discussing things that otherwise couldn't be discussed, eliciting emotive force, or pushing back against the system, profanity, from a functional standpoint, has a number of uses. And so what we say then is that profanity acts as a kind of social tool. Well, this particular kind of social tool fits into a broader idea from a researcher named Howard Giles, G-I-L-E-S. Giles works with what's called communication accommodation theory. Giles's idea is that people oftentimes adjust the way they communicate when they're with certain people or in certain contexts. And these adjustments reflect either a convergence or a divergence. So convergence is the first of Giles's concepts. It's this idea that we sometimes change the way we communicate in order to fit in. Divergence, on the other hand, is the opposite. It's how we change the way we communicate specifically because we're trying not to fit in, because we want to stand out. Now, into convergence and divergence comes this notion of profanity. So if you think about children as they grow and they enter into social circles with kids at school or somewhere else, we find that oftentimes they will adjust the way they communicate to fit in. So if a group of kids on the playground is using the A word and the S word or the B word or the F word, a 9-year-old kid may start to use those words because he wants to fit in. And so in this manner, he's illustrating Giles's notion of convergence. So profanity, again from a functional standpoint, can be used to converge. At the same time, profanity can also be used to represent divergence. So on a Christian college campus, like at Oklahoma Christian, we typically would assume students are not using a great deal of profanity. Now never mind the fact that many of them, in fact, do use profanity. The reality is that oftentimes some of the people that are using their profanity do so because they're trying to stand out. They want to send a message that says, I'm not a goody-goody like everybody else around here. I'm cool enough that I can use profanity, and there's nothing you can do about it. In fact, I know it's against the rules, and I'm going to do it anyway. Now, that might be useful in crafting the student's identity. To whatever extent that's true, the student is illustrating divergence. They're communicating in a manner different than everyone else, and profanity can, quite frankly, be quite useful in that regard. So whether it's divergence or convergence, Giles's communication accommodation theory gives us another lens through which to see how profanity might be used. Profanity, of course, as it's being used, also occurs at certain times of life. Now, of course, anybody at any age or at any point in life can use profanity, and in fact, many do. It's become a kind of rite of passage. Elizabeth Churchill is a researcher who studied the use of profanity as a rite of passage. And one of the things that she finds is that when kids move through adolescence, they oftentimes pick up the habit of using profanity, partly because it's a way of convergence, which is the communication accommodation theory we talked about a moment ago. But another part of it is that it's a rite of passage. It's just part of what adolescents do as they're growing up. In the same way that they're asserting their independence, in the same way that they're being mildly or perhaps significantly rebellious, profanity can be seen as a way for those kids to signal, I'm no longer a kid, I'm now more of an adult. Now, never mind the fact that they're not really adults. In fact, at this point, they're not even emerging adults. They're still adolescents. They're still kids. But they use the kind of language, they use the profane terms that they've heard older people use. And in doing so, these kids believe that they're going through a rite of passage, that they're making the transition from being a kid to being an adult. Notice again how that's a very functional way of looking at this profanity. Now, of course, profanity is not only used by people who are articulating those words are heard by someone. And so another line of research asked the questions, so what do people think about those that use profanity? Sarah Sood, S-O-O-D, is another researcher who's looked at the relationship of profanity and the people around you. One of the things that's found in Sood's research is that profanity tends to be correlated with the perception that the people using those words are not as well educated, and that the people using profanity are of a lower class socioeconomically than are others. Now, of course, you can be in any socioeconomic class. You can have a blue-collar job, a white-collar job. You can make $1 million a year. You can make $18,000 a year. Anybody can use profanity. But the perception of the people using the profanity is what's important for Sood in her research. What she's saying to us is that when we hear these words, we tend to equate them. We tend to correlate them in our minds with the kinds of things that someone who's in the lower class would do. Or we tend to associate them in our minds with the kinds of things that people that are less educated would do. In fact, I remember talking to an English teacher years ago, and having taught high school English for many years, one of the things that she used to tell her students whenever they used profanity was that profanity was the mark of an uneducated person. If you can't come up with any better words to express yourself, well, then that just shows you're ignorant. Well, to whatever extent that's true, Sarah Sood would come along, and in her research, she would say, that's how people think it works, even if it doesn't actually work that way. Now let's return for a moment to the notion of who's actually using profanity. As you might have noticed throughout this course, I'm interested in presenting to you the research on the gender differences in communication. And so when it comes to profanity, we find also a gender difference with this kind of interpersonal communication, just as we did with other kinds of interpersonal communication. Gary Selnow, S-E-L-N-O-W, is a researcher who's also studied profanity from a functional standpoint, and he's found a significant gender difference in the use of profanity. Specifically, Selnow's research finds that males are more frequently using profanity than are females. Now, of course, that's not to say females never use profanity. It's just to say that comparatively, more males are using profanity and doing so more frequently than are females. And one reason for this has to do with the kinds of things we said earlier. Profanity can oftentimes be used to equate themselves, or those that use them, with a rebellious kind of an attitude, a pushing back against the system kind of an attitude. And that presentation of self is more in line with the accepted male gender roles in American culture and less in line with the accepted female gender roles. So to that extent, we would assume more males are using profanity because they feel as if it's helpful in crafting this identity of themselves and fitting into or converging with the male gender stereotype. We also know from Selnow's research that males are far more conscious of the link between the use of profanity and the resulting emotive force. They're more aware of how the profane words they use are affecting those around them. Now that would make sense if, in fact, there's this identity crafting project that males are a part of as they use profanity. Comparatively, Selnow's research also finds that females are less accepting of profanity, and they tend to have more conservative standards when it comes to the use of profanity. Females are more likely to be bothered by the profanity than are males. Interestingly enough, males are often more likely to be bothered by profanity when females are using it as opposed to when males are. So there's obviously a bit of a double standard in all this. The point of Selnow's research, and people like him, is that profanity does differ along gender lines, whether it be in terms of usage, whether it be in terms of how we see the profanity being used. The fact of the matter is one's gender, at least in American culture, tends to also show differences in the use of profanity. One more thing about gender differences. I said earlier that profanity is a cultural universal. One of the other things that's universal across cultures is this idea that males are more often using profanity than are females. So while we might say that the relative use of profanity favors males in enacting the male gender roles in American culture, that would also be true of the male gender roles in most other cultures as well. And so when you begin to string all this together, you begin to see profanity being something that crosses cultural lines and is quite useful. Now, as I said, there's more research we could talk about on profanity, but most of it tends to follow the same lines we talked about a minute ago. Seeing profanity as a rite of passage, seeing profanity as a useful social tool, understanding how profanity works in convergence or divergence, and so most of the research simply wants to talk about specific contexts where that comes to pass. So for example, earlier we mentioned the idea that profanity is oftentimes associated with a rite of passage. It shouldn't surprise you then to find that there's research that discovers that many people that join the Marines or join the Navy, whether they're male or female, the use of their profanity begins to rise. Or to put it differently, if you go off and join the Marines, chances are pretty good you're going to use more profanity after you've joined the Marines than you did before. That's because the Marine Corps, like other branches of the military, is what's called a profanity-favoring culture. Now, what we mean by a profanity-favoring culture is simply the idea that says that some cultures tend to create a climate of greater acceptance of profanity. And in fact, some create a greater expectation of the use of profanity. So, for example, there are certain what are called power and performance sports, things like basketball and football, hockey and soccer. Violent, fast-paced kinds of sports that are often dominated by males. We find that in those particular kinds of power and performance sports, there is a greater climate that favors the use of profanity, so much so that there's a greater expectation of that. Now, we can go back to Giles's research and talk about how convergence might be a part of what's going on there, but the fact of the matter is you can't just look at the people that are involved, you also have to look at the overarching environment. Religious institutions, on the other hand, tend to be the exact opposite. They tend to have a climate that disfavors the use of profanity. And so when profanity is used in those contexts, the profanity tends to have even greater emotive force. So all of the research on profanity could be dived into in greater detail, but I think at this point we've talked about it enough to get a feel for the lay of the land. And so to whatever extent you use profanity or whatever extent you hear it, my hope is that by understanding this research, you can see better how profanity as a social tool reflects a kind of interpersonal communication.